It's time for the yearly tradition once again. Time to count down my favorite games from the previous year. Now, the first thing I bet you're wondering is, why is this video a top 10? Because the last 2 years I did this, it was a top 15. The reason, very simply, is that 2018 wasn't that good of a year gaming-wise for me. It's not that I didn't play any good games last year. In fact, I played enough where I could extend this to a top 15 if I really wanted to, but I don't think it was a good enough year to make it worth a top 15. So you're just getting a top 10 this time around. I made those past 2 lists top 15s because there were a lot of games I wanted to showcase in those past 2 years. In 2018 though, not so much. Just to clarify for those at home, this is not the list of my favorite games that came out in 2018. It's the list of my favorite games that I played for the first time in 2018. So don't be surprised if you don't see a lot of this year's heavy hitters. I probably haven't played them. Now with all that said, let's begin. The Sexy Brutale is an interesting game to be sure. Think of it as a combination of Luigi's Mansion, Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, and maybe a little bit of Majora's Mask. Basically, you're inside a gigantic mansion, forced to constantly repeat the same 12 hours over and over again. And over the course of these 12 hours, all the guests in the mansion end up getting killed. And as you would imagine, you have to prevent their deaths from happening. However, you have to do it without ever being in the same room as the victims or the killers. With each murder you stop, you gain a new ability that allows you to progress further into the mansion. And the mansion itself looks really cool, and as you go through the game, you learn a lot both about the mansion itself and the guests inhabiting it. Then there's the deaths you have to prevent, which I kinda have mixed feelings on. On one hand, I really like seeing each of the characters' routines throughout the day, as you start to see new sides of events you saw earlier and gain a fuller picture of everything that happens within these 12 hours. And the deaths themselves are really creative. My only problem is the solutions are kind of disappointing by comparison. But overall, the game's really enjoyable, and I really wish I played it before making top 10 video game plot twists, because the one in this game would have made it really high on the list. You know, it seems like every year I come across another super challenging yet super enjoyable game. In 2015 it was Guacamelee, 2016 it was Not a Hero, 2017 it was Cuphead, and in 2018 it was Hotline Miami. Actually, it was both Hotline Miami games. Both games have a really fun combat system where every kill is super satisfying. This is mainly due to the fact that you can't go in guns a-blazing. You have to be very careful. Not only do the guns have limited ammo, but they also alert nearby enemies to your presence, which can be a positive if you know what you're doing, and a negative if you don't. On one hand, you can use it to lure them out, but on the flip side, you can't have them gang up on you because you die in one hit. It's just as much a stealth game as it is an action game. Not only that, but you can choose from a bunch of different abilities to help you throughout the level, and the game has an awesome techno soundtrack. But everything I've said so far can apply to both Hotline Miami games. Which one is at this spot? Simple. Hotline Miami 2. The reason being, it has a much more interesting story. You get the perspectives of a bunch of different characters in the game, and the events don't necessarily happen in chronological order. Basically, think of it like Pulp Fiction, but more complicated and violent. That should really tell you all you need to know. You know, the hardest entry I've had to decide in a lot of my recent top 10s, including this one, is the number 10 spot. This is because when I make them, I start at number 1 and work my way down. So by the time I get to 10, I've already used up a lot of the better choices. So it can be hard to decide on something for the number 10 spot, and sometimes I feel like I get it wrong. One such case is Top 10 Darkest Games Round 2. I put Little Inferno at the number 10 spot, when in reality, I probably should have found a place on the list for Frostpunk. Coincidentally enough, both of them center around a dystopian future where the world is increasingly getting colder. Frostpunk certainly is an interesting beast. It's both a city builder and a survival game, neither of which are genres I tend to play very much. much. But this one managed to win me over, both because of the gritty steampunk aesthetic and the gameplay. You see, in order for your city to survive, there's a couple resources that you need to keep track of. Raw food and food rations so your citizens don't starve, wood and steel to build buildings, and most notably, coal to keep the generator active. You see, since you're in a frozen wasteland, you also have to keep your city warm enough in order to prevent your citizens from freezing to death. Not to mention, there are other mechanics, such as expeditions to explore new places, inventing new items to help you survive, and of course, signing laws into effect both to make things run more smoothly and give people a sense of purpose after they've lost all hope. And the game's not some sort of endless survival fest either, unless you're playing in endless mode. It plays out like a story that does have an ending. It's not just the main story either. There are several other scenarios where you can play out a different story, and the developers seem to be adding more and more content to the game. So if you're a big fan of survival games or city builders, Frostpunk comes highly recommended. For those of you wondering what my favorite video game genre is, it's the 3D platformer. And let me tell you, it might just be the worst genre to have as your favorite. The reason being, it's not trendy enough for the AAA developers to touch it with a 10-foot pole, and it's not nostalgic enough for there to be a lot of indie alternatives. I mean, just look at 2017. That was considered a boom for 3D platformers, when not only were there only 4 high-profile ones that came out, but one of them was largely seen as a disappointment, and another one was a remaster of a couple games that came out decades ago. So in order to find a new 3D platformer to play in 2018, I had to delve back into the distant year of 2011 and sail the tumultuous waters of G2A to get my hands on Alice Madness Returns. And it was worth it. Here's a question for you. Can a bright and colorful 3D platformer also be dark and disturbing at the same time? I mean, I had that answered for me quite a bit ago when I played Epic Mickey, but Alice Madness Returns gives this question an even stronger yes. And interestingly enough, the two were only released a year apart. Alice Madness Returns is a game that's filled to the brim with gorgeous looking environments. It's also tied for the 3rd darkest game I've ever played. The story's pretty interesting, focusing on Alice's deteriorating mental state, presumably resulting from a childhood trauma. I also liked the various items you unlocked, and the combat was pretty fun. I only really have 2 issues with the game. For starters, there's no bosses, which I know not every game needs, but the way this one was set up, it felt like there should have been a boss to cap off each area. And secondly is the levels themselves. Sure, from a visual perspective, they look amazing, but from a gameplay perspective, I don't know why, they just kind of felt like they were on autopilot to me. You know, there was one prominent, long-standing game series that I tried for the first time this year, Far Cry. This was mainly for 2 reasons. 1, I was planning on remaking top 10 villains and figured Voss would probably be a good candidate, and 2, Far Cry 5 looked pretty interesting, so I decided to check out some of the older ones as well. For those of you wondering, I played Far Cry 3, 4, and 5, and out of all of them, Far Cry 3 was my favorite. Mainly because it's the only one I finished. I stopped the other 2 after a couple hours. I don't know why, just kinda got bored I guess. But I certainly didn't get bored with Far Cry 3. While I certainly enjoyed a good deal of the story missions, particularly the one where you're burning up the drugs with a flamethrower, my personal favorite part of the game was a lot of the side content. Hunting down animals to upgrade your carrying capacity, and tracking down plants to craft syringes to help you survive was a lot of fun. I enjoyed climbing the radio towers to get a better view of the map, and liberating the outposts was super satisfying, constantly stealth killing enemies. Maybe that's why I fell out of love with the series. Not enough stealth kills in the later games. The island you're exploring also looks great, and the story is pretty good, even if it does feel like it starts to slow down a bit halfway through. In 2018, I played Pony Island, and it was alright. I thought it was an interesting game, but I wasn't a huge fan of the gameplay, and a lot of the fourth wall breaking in it I had already seen in Undertale. The reason I played it when I did, though, is because I was preparing myself for the other game Daniel Mullins released, The Hex. The main premise of The Hex is fairly simple. 6 video game characters, each from very different games, meet up in a bar. The bartender gets a call saying that one of them is about to commit a murder. And that's about all I'm going to tell you. Because as you would imagine from a game made by the creator of Pony Island, this game is filled to the brim with surprises. So the less you know going in, the better. The only other thing I'm going to say is this is a game about gaming itself. It takes a close look at video games, and I don't just mean the pointing and laughing at various cliches, which in and of itself has become a cliche at this point, although they do that. It also takes a look at how both gamers and developers end up affecting games. Basically, think of it like a dark, screwed up version of Wreck-It Ralph. As for the gameplay, it's a lot of fun. As you would imagine, it changes drastically quite a bit as you do go through 6 different video game genres. And each one is done really well. Not to the point where I would want to see any of them as their own standalone title, but good enough that I had fun with each one, and I really appreciated the game keeping me on my toes with all the changes. I'd say more, but like I said earlier, this is one of those games where the less you know going in, the better. Okay, this next one you all saw coming. It was never a question of if this game was going to be on the list, it was only a question of where. The only real shocker here is the fact that it's not number 1. But I've kept you waiting in suspense long enough, you already know what it is. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Now to start off with, I already know what you're thinking. How the heck is this not higher on the list? Well, you gotta keep in mind my stance on multiplayer games. I don't tend to stick with them that long. Sure, I'll come back and play them from time to time, but mostly I'm a single player type of guy. And yes, I know there are modes like World of Light and Classic Mode, but those are single player modes in a game built around multiplayer. There's kind of a difference there. In spite of all that though, I have a great time playing this game. Every character's back now, and I'm good with quite a few of them. Okay, good's a relative term. I enjoy playing as quite a few of them. The process of unlocking them all was a lot of fun and encouraged me to play as a lot of characters that I typically wouldn't try. The new rule presets save a lot of time, and the Final Smash meter allows you to utilize Final Smashes without needing to have items turned on. Also, every stage I could have ever wanted is back, and that's really all I have to say. I mean, the game just came out and everyone's been talking about it. You've probably heard all of this already. If there's one word I would use to describe Sunset Overdrive, it would be fun. The first thing to note is the art style. It looks somewhat realistic, but with a colorful and cartoony spin on the whole thing. The premise of the game is just the right amount of ridiculous. An energy drink company released a new drink that turned a bunch of people into mutants, so now they're quarantining Sunset City in order to prevent their stock prices from dropping. And you're left there to find other survivors to help fight the mutants, scavengers, and Fizco security. And in order to do this, you're given a wide variety of over-the-top and super fun weapons to use, which makes a lot of sense, considering the fact that this is the same studio that made Ratchet and Clank. But the weapons aren't the biggest part of what makes this game fun. Oh no, that would be the maneuverability. This game has a parkour system that puts Infamous to shame. You can grind on rails pretty much anywhere and have a huge control over it. You can bounce on various objects, swing off lampposts, and even run on walls. And the game greatly encourages you to do this because they give you amps, which amplify either your weapons or your other abilities, but they don't kick in until you've built up enough of a combo parkouring your way around. And how do you get these amps? Simple. By finding a bunch of collectibles throughout the city. And boy, do you know how much I love collectibles. The missions are also a lot of fun. They're really high energy, have a lot of variety to them, and feel like they last the perfect amount of time. Not too long and not too short. The game's also got a cast of eccentric, memorable, and likable characters. While everyone around you is at least a little bit weird, the game almost seems to have a respect for their weirdness, which is something I can appreciate. But as you would imagine from all this insanity, the game does not take itself seriously one bit. It's not the funniest game I've ever played, but it's still pretty funny, and breaks the fourth wall about as much as Kid Icarus Uprising. Simply put, Sunset Overdrive is a game for when you're just feeling down and want to have a good time. At the tail end of last year, I played the original Danganronpa, and I liked it so much that I went on to play every other game in the series and even watch the anime. As you've probably guessed by the way I'm framing this, number 2 on the list is going to be a Danganronpa game. The only question is, which one? Number 2 on this list, and my favorite Danganronpa game, is Danganronpa Ultra Despair. I'm kidding, it's Danganronpa 2. Since most of why I like the series can be summed up in my entry on the first game on last year's list, I'm instead gonna spend this time explaining why Danganronpa 2 is my personal favorite. For starters, I think it has the strongest overall cast in the series. I'm not gonna go into any more detail on that because, well, that's for my next countdown. The sheer size of Jabberwock Island allows for a wide variety in settings and potential crime scenes. The cases in this game were a lot more complex and interesting than the original, although I do think V3 is about on par with them. I thought Monami was a great new addition. She serves both as a great comedic foil for Monokuma and a source of a lot of questions as to who she really is and where her allegiances really lie. The game also might have my favorite overarching story in the franchise. Sure, the original did a great job of making it feel like you're getting closer and closer to an answer, but this one poses a lot more interesting questions to think about before they're answered. My only issue with the game is that the changes made to the trials were kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, the Rebuttal Showdown was an epic new addition, and the points of consent probably should have been in the first game, but on the flip side, Logic Drive was a bit frustrating and, oh my god, what the hell did they do to Hangman's Gambit? But overall, fantastic game, highly recommend it. Unless you haven't played the first one yet, in which case you really need to play the original first. Okay, so before we get to number 1, it's time for the obligatory honorable mentions. 60 Parsecs, a sequel to 60 Seconds. Seems like an improvement, but I haven't spent much time with it yet. Steven Universe Save the Light has a great art style and a really fun battle system, but it got a bit too hard for me at one point. Orwell Ignorance's Strength. It's a good game, but not nearly as good as the original, even though it added voice acting. Thumper feels intense, but probably would be better in VR, which I think is where it originated. Little Nightmares. It's a great looking puzzle game that tells an interesting story, although I couldn't really get that into the DLC. Shaq Fu, A Legendary Born. This is one of those games that probably shouldn't exist, but at the same time, I'm very glad it does exist. Donut County, a short, fun, and satisfying puzzle game. Celeste, everyone's been talking about it, and yeah, it is a good game. Has a very unique representation of mental health, but at the same time, it is another super hard pixel art 2D platformer, which we already have a ton of. Not to say it doesn't do it well, but it's not really unique in that regard. Great soundtrack though. Guacamelee 2. I liked the first Guacamelee, and I think this one's a step up. Ultimate Custom Night. I haven't played a Five Nights at Freddy's game before this year, but I really enjoyed this one. I found it interesting how almost every single animatronic had a different thing you had to worry about. And I thought it was fun to see how much I could go up against. Bayonetta. Number 10 was a toss-up between this and the Sexy Brutale, but that one won out because I had a lot more to say about it. Bayonetta, there's not really much to say. The game has a lot of awesome action, both in the cutscenes and in the gameplay. But anyway, on to number 1. So, my favorite game of 2018. Originally, I was going to make a Fallout 76 joke here, but there's another game that came out in 2018 that's much more relevant to mention. Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 is not number 1 on this list. I haven't played it, but just judging from reactions, it seems like it was the most well-received game of the year. People were enthralled by this epic adventure crafted by Rockstar Games. And this year, I was enthralled by an an epic adventure crafted by Rockstar Games. But it wasn't this game, it was the last game they made, GTA 5. Growing up, Grand Theft Auto was the big game series that I was never allowed to play. Don't take pity on me though, cause I never really had a desire to play it either. However, considering the fact that the #1 spot on every single one of my best games of the year lists went to a game with a similar gameplay style to GTA, it seemed almost inevitable that I would check the series out. And since GTA 5 was really popular and I heard it had a really good single player campaign, I decided to give it a try, and I was not disappointed. The funny part about GTA 5 is that there are plenty of reasons why I shouldn't put it at #1. I mean, Danganronpa 2 is my favorite entry in a series that I've been talking about non-stop as of late. Sunset Overdrive has a wider array of qualities that I tend to look for in games, and Smash Bros as well, Smash Bros. And to top it off, I don't even really like the gameplay that much. I mean, the driving's alright, but the shooting, I don't know, it's just not that interesting to me. So yeah, unlike the other years, this entry isn't really set in stone. But don't get me wrong, I do have my reason for putting it here. I really like the single player campaign. The story is great. It essentially plays out as a big, dumb action movie, but the best big, dumb action movie imaginable. The game's absolutely hilarious, the characters are really memorable, and the missions can be freaking awesome. The heists are the obvious highlights, but there's also missions like the one where you shoot a plane out of the sky and then drive over to where it lands, or the one where you blow up a big tech CEO, or even the one where you do yoga. Okay, I'll fully admit that one kind of sucked. But I think it was really the story and characters and how the missions play into those aspects that really made me want to push forward and ignore some of the game's less interesting aspects. I wanted to see what these characters were going to do next. Despite the fact that it's essentially just 3 guys committing crimes, the story really felt like an adventure. And yes, I am well aware that I'm saying that I liked a Grand Theft Auto game for the story. And yes, I am aware that that likely makes me the biggest dork on the planet, but I don't care. But now, here's how I'd like to end this video. At the beginning, I said that 2018 was not that good of a year for me gaming-wise, and I stand by that. But on the flip side, 2019 looks like it's going to be a lot better. I'm already hooked on Beholder 2, and I'm enjoying that new Spider-Man game. Plus, I recently got Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Travis Strikes Again is coming out soon, and might actually be out by the time you're seeing this. And of course, there's Kingdom Hearts 3, which is going to be a lot of fun. And, oh yeah, Psychonauts 2 comes out later this year. I am Tafafilizer, and I'm pumped for 2019.